Good morning, afternoon to everyone. My name is Fanny Glover. I'm with the Early Care and Learning Council, and we are going to get started in a few minutes. We just didn't want to leave you out there too long and without acknowledging your presence, because you could have chosen to be anyplace else, but you chose to be with us today. And we are extremely pleased to have you. So just sit tight. If you need to grab another cup of coffee or grab a glass of water or whatever, just give us a couple more minutes. We want to give those who may have different clock times to chime in, because we are going to have an amazing speaker today and we don't want anyone to miss out on anything. So just give us a couple more minutes, hang in there, and you're going to be in for a treat. We'll be back. Good afternoon again, everyone. We are about to get started. We thank you for joining us. And on the call today, we also have Mariah Hebert and Brooke Reese, who is providing the support to make everything run smoothly for all of us. We are really honored today to have with us Dr. Brower. She's going to discuss surviving and thriving through the pandemic, why this is so hard, and how to make the best of the bad. Well, with Dr. Tracy Brower, I am not going to go through the long spiel of all of why we got started, but we're glad that you're joining us. So let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Tracy Brower. She's a sociologist and the author of Bring Work to Life by Bringing Life to Work. In addition, she is a contributor for Forbes and Fast Company and a principal with the Applied Research and Consulting Group at Steelcast. Tracy is an executive advisor to the Cody Societies and to the MSU Master Industrial Mathematics program. Tracy's work has been featured in TEDx, the Wall Street Journal, Work-Life Balance in the 21st Century, and many other bodies of work. She holds a PhD in sociology, a Master of Management in Organizational Culture, and a Master of Corporate Real Estate with a workplace specialization. Now I turn the floor over to Dr. Tracy Brower. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Fanny. You are just so kind, and I'm a huge fan of yours and fan of the agency and all the work that you're doing. So I can't thank you enough for having me. And what a wonderful, wonderful introduction. I appreciate it. And then everybody has to just lower their expectations so we can stay humble. So, hey, thanks you all for joining us. This is such an amazing and cataclysmic time. And we just want to talk through, like, how do we think about the stress? How do we think about how we don't just survive this pandemic, but how we thrive through it? So I have had the pleasure of being able to be a wife and a mom and a student and an employee, and I get to do some writing on the side. I started researching work life when I went back to school. Our son was 5 at the time, and our daughter was 9, and our son said to his class, "My mom's going back to school because she didn't get it right the first time." So it was a great experience to try to juggle everything. And I was just never sure about that concept of work-life balance. It seemed like it was more about fulfillment and integration, and that work was part of life and life was part of work. So that's some of how that started for me. One of the things we know about the pandemic is that we are really, really seeing lots and lots of mental health challenges. There have been studies and studies on this recently. One that I quoted in a recent article said that 75% of people were feeling some level of stress or fatigue or challenge with their mental health. And it ran the gamut from emotional exhaustion to sadness to difficulty thinking to confusion to not being able to follow up. And so we know that what's happening is that in these cataclysmic times, things just aren't as they should be. Our instinct as human beings, based on our biology and based on millennia during which we have been evolving and kind of living on the plains and living on the savannas, is to be together. And our instinct under threat or pressure or worry is to find strength in numbers. And as we've had to separate from other people, we've had cognitive dissonance because we haven't been able to come together in the same ways. And there are lots of other things causing a lot of our stress and fatigue. And we'll talk through some of those and talk through some of how we respond. I love this model of well-being. I think I can make this go away. Oh, there we go. I love this model of well-being. This is actually Steelcase's model, and I work for an amazing company in Steelcase. But the model is all about a holistic sense of well-being, not just the physical well-being, but also our cognitive and our emotional well-being. So I really, really appreciate this lens. I also think that we can put safety in the middle of this lens as well, because all of a sudden safety is more important to us than ever. And you think about Maslow's hierarchy, we've all heard about that, you know, the triangle with the needs. And usually we are thinking at the top of that Maslow triangle of needs. We worry about belonging and giving people a sense of belonging. And we worry about esteem and people feeling valued. And we worry about self-actualizing. But what's happened for a lot of us is we've kind of been bumped down to the bottom of the hierarchy, where we're worried about our physiological safety and health and our security, maybe to a greater extent than we've ever had. We all worry about all of those things all of the time at some level, but we have been kind of exacerbating some of those lower level issues, and more people are struggling in more and more of those kinds of ways. So we'll talk through that as well. So here is a question for you. We'd like you to go ahead and put your answers in the chat. So the question is, to what extent has your well-being been compromised through the pandemic? A lot. Honestly, I'm struggling and it's tough. B, somewhat. It's been tough, but I've been keeping my chin up. C, not so much. It hasn't been as terrible for me. Or D, none of the above. It's a long story. So if you don't mind going ahead and putting your A, B, C, or D in the chat. Fanny and Brooke and Mariah are going to be watching the chat for us, and we won't make this a scientific count, nor will we audit. we won't audit later, but it will be great to just get a sense from you about your well-being and how things are going for you in terms of well-being. So Fanny, Brooke, what kinds of responses are you seeing? What are people mostly saying? A's or B's or C's or D's?
Looks like I'm seeing a lot of B's.
Yeah,
Brooke,
a lot
Mariah?
of B's. Yep, a lot of B's.
All right, a preponderance of B's. That makes a lot of sense. One of the things that we know as well is that well-being can go up and down over time. We all have different circadian rhythms, so sometimes we can feel better at one part of the day than another. We can feel different from week to week. One of the things that we know is also true is that this pandemic has been so significant in terms of the changes on a day-to-day basis and sometimes on a week-by-week basis. And so just when you feel like you've got some normalcy, things change again. There's a wonderful comparison to thinking about being out on a boat all day. You know how you're out on a boat all day and you come back at the end of the day and you're just exhausted and you say to yourself, well, what's that about? I've been spending time with friends and maybe having a beer or an iced tea and I've been relaxing. Why am I so tired? Interestingly, when you're on a boat, you have to constantly find a sense of equilibrium at some level, even if it's unconscious. You're always doing a little balancing to find that equilibrium. And so that is what's happening to us during the pandemic as well. We're always having to re-find that sense of equilibrium, that sense of normalcy in the midst of such a cataclysmic event. So this is exactly what we'll talk about, is kind of those ups and downs and how we get through those. One of the things that's so significant about this time is the issue of choice. Like, our choice has been taken away significantly. Lots and lots of us were sent home. Our children were sent home from childcare providers, from schools. We haven't been able to go to the fitness club or, for goodness sakes, get our hair cut the way we want to. And so that lack of choice can be really, really difficult. We've done some really wonderful work at Steelcase around correlating choice with engagement. When people have a greater sense of choice and control, they tend to be significantly more engaged. In addition, choice is absolutely connected to mental health. A fundamental part of our mental health is some sense of autonomy. We don't all get to choose everything every day because we're always in concert with other people, and our responsibilities have to balance out our choices. But mental health is absolutely linked to choice, and we're having less of it. The other really interesting thing is that choice is actually correlated with commitment. There was a wonderful study that's super memorable where people were told that there was going to be a drawing for a lottery, and some of them were just given a lottery ticket with a number on it, and others were asked to write down their own number. And all of it was the same in terms of the chances of winning, because it was all random anyway. But then what the organizers did is they asked to buy back the lottery ticket from people before they did the drawing. And they had to spend 5 times as much to buy back the tickets that people had made their own numbers for, because people just had a greater sense of commitment to their own number, even though it was a random drawing. And so when we feel control, when we feel like we have some say in how our world is going, how our life is going, and the small choices we get to make day to day, we tend to feel greater commitment. All of this has been significantly reduced, as we know, during the COVID crisis. And that is a really big part of what causes us stress, pressure, fatigue. So how do we respond? One is to take back as much control as you can. Maybe that looks like setting your schedule for the day. Maybe it's as small as making a choice that, by goodness, you're going to get outside once during the day between meetings. Maybe it's a choice that you're going to, I don't know, make sure that you do the math tutoring with your child in the afternoons instead of the morning because you both feel better about math in the afternoons. Maybe it's a choice to do more emails early in the day and meetings that are more collaborative later in the day. Whatever that looks like for you, any amount of choice that you can take back is a really big deal. And sequencing your day is helpful. There's actually a fair amount of research that says that sometimes those more focused tasks that require more concentration are better done during the morning, whatever morning looks like for you, even if that's a later morning start. And that sometimes tasks that require more divergent thinking can be better in the afternoons. Whatever works for you, sometimes that sequencing is helpful. And this is some great advice from Howard Sublett, who's an expert on agile processes. Make a list, really prioritize and check things off the list. Even if it's a little list, even if you're not such a list person, it can give you a sense of control. It can give you a sense of, these are the few things I'm going to get done today, or the few things that I want to focus on, and I can check them off. So making a list and checking it twice is sometimes a really good way to start to take back control. Another reason that we may be feeling really stressed right now is all about friction. When you can't do things in the usual way, it raises it to a level of consciousness. Like, it just brings a level of friction and consciousness and mental effort that you wouldn't normally have had to spend. So nothing's automatic, right? Like, you're not getting up on an automatic basis and dropping the kids off at daycare or taking kids to school and going to work. You're thinking hard about everything. We're starting to get into more rhythm after what has it been 8 or 9 weeks, but that friction and that consciousness can still be a challenge. You log on to that video conference that you've logged on to 100 times before, and it didn't work the same way this time, and that creates a sense of friction. The other thing that's interesting is we have less time to reflect. One of the things that happens to us is when we're in different environments, we tend to remember and reflect differently because the physical environment, whether it's the yard outside or the walk that you took or the grocery store that you were able to go to, or maybe the park that you were able to go to, all of those tend to help our memories and help our reflection. And what's happening when we're all home is that we have less variety in the physical surroundings and therefore less of an opportunity to reflect and less of that spatial memory. The other thing people say is when they're in an office or when they're in a work environment that's not the home environment, they get more time to reflect between meetings. So you might have had a meeting in one room and then you went to another room, and that gave you some reflection along the way. And so those are elements of friction that just make a really big difference in terms of our mental state. So our response is to learn, like, get as good as you can at whatever you have that's new, and that will allow you to have less need to be consciously thinking about it and spend less mental energy on it. And you're adapting. That's one of the other things is we know neurologically that the mind is not elastic. If you stretch the mind in a new direction, it doesn't go back to the way it was. It's plastic rather than elastic, and it, once stretched, doesn't necessarily go back to where it was before. So all those adaptations, all those stretches, all those new things you're trying and learning and struggling with and challenged with are helping you to adapt in a really good way. And you might build some new habits. You might build some new habits to take a walk between each of your video conferences, or maybe get out for a breath of fresh air on the fire escape, or maybe spend an extra couple of quality minutes with your family in a new way. Those new habits that you can do on a more routine basis can be really, really helpful to you feeling that sense of familiarity. Let me share one other thing. Fanny, questions? Were you going to jump in?
No.
Okay, sounds good.
Some positive comments, great ideas, great comments.
Awesome, that's terrific, terrific. This is like an auction, you know, I can't necessarily see you making a bid, but I can hear you breathing, so I love it. So one other thing I want to tell you about and then ask you another question. A really big part of this challenge that we have right now is all about social. It's all about our connections with other people. We miss people. We miss being around people. We have our small group of kind of intimate folks that we're connected with, and that's a beautiful thing, but we're not able to see as many variety of people. And work is fundamentally social. Whether you're an introvert or an extrovert on that continuum, all of us need time alone and all of us need time together, just in different proportions. And so that element of work at work that allows you to be social is really important. And it's a reason for grief that we don't have as much of that diversity in terms of our connections. The other thing is that our connections aren't as automatic. You know, when you go to work, you just kind of get to run into people. You get to chat with someone at the coffee bar, or you get to run into your work colleague, and you don't have to make a point of texting them or calling them or reaching out to them on email. It's just more automatic. The other thing that we miss about the situation today is that secondary network. There's a beautiful concept called Dunbar's number. Dunbar's number says that about 150 people is the core group of people that you can stay in touch with no matter what. That's the people that you know what's going on in their life. They know what's going on in yours because you see each other that much. Those are the people that if you run into a restaurant sometime in the future when we can go to restaurants, if you run into them in a restaurant, you can just sit right down with them and just join them and it's not awkward in the least. The next circle out is your secondary network, and the third circle out is your tertiary network. And so you might have 500 Facebook friends, but they're not all people that you would just sit right down with in a restaurant. You might have 5,000 LinkedIn connections, but they may not be people that you're close with. Those secondary and tertiary people are the ones that we're often connecting with, like in the work cafe or the coffee shop. And it would be creepy to reach out to them through text because you just don't know them as well. So you can't stay connected in the same way that you can when you all show up together somewhere. That's the parent that you run into at your drop off at daycare, or it's the teacher that you might see regularly that teaches your child. So what do? We reach out in new ways and be really planful about it. We know that what people are saying is that the more they stay connected with others, the better they feel mentally. And the more they can embrace new norms for connecting, the better. They might have like a wine down Wednesday. I guess that could be wine, W-I-N-E or W-H-I-N-E, depending on how you're feeling. They might, arrange a neighborhood cul-de-sac yoga session, but those new norms about connecting end up being really, really important. There's some beautiful work on generosity as well. The more people express generosity, the better they feel in terms of their own mental health because they're staying connected to the community. We are absolutely wired to connect. These are some beautiful books recently that are really making those points. The Village Effect by Susan Pinker specifically talks about how face-to-face connections with other people is 100% correlated with our physical health, our emotional health, all kinds of well-being, physically, cognitively, emotionally. And interesting, there's a book called A Paradise Built in Hell by Rebecca Salmet. And what she does is, it was written a little while ago, she goes through all of these cataclysmic events like the great San Francisco earthquake and fire, she goes through the great Mexico earthquake, she goes through Katrina, she talks about 9/11. And one of the things she finds is that when we're going through difficulty, one of the things people report is that they feel more connected to others. One of the primary ways that we get bonded with other people is by going through really difficult situations. And so the opportunity for us to feel that bond, as difficult as this is a big deal. The other thing that Salmet talks about, which is exciting, is the idea of all of us giving and all of us receiving. In normal times, there might be those who have more to give and those who have more to receive. And sometimes those relationships shift over time because we all have different realities over time. But the really nice thing that Salmet talks about in difficult events is we always have something that we need and we always have something we can give. So this is kind of the we'll trade hand sanitizer for toilet paper kind of example. Or I might be able to help you network to a new job opportunity, or I might be able to offer childcare for you, and you can offer child support for me in terms of learning that my child needs in an area that isn't as strong. So there's that really nice reciprocal relationship that can happen. So bottom line, we're wired to connect. Part of what is stressful is not being able to connect as much, but the more we can be intentional about that, the better we'll be in terms of mental health. So here is a question for you. Same deal. If you want to put this in the chat box, that would be terrific. To what extent are you feeling a sense of social isolation or missing your broader network? A, desperately. I love my inner circle, but it's small. B, somewhat. I feel I've been able to stay pretty well connected. C, not so much. It doesn't feel all that unnatural for me. Or D, I'm pleading the fifth on this one. So go ahead and give us a sense of what your responses are. You're A, desperately missing people, B, somewhat missing people, C, not struggling so much, or D, you don't want to answer this one and you'll maybe tell us later in a social setting. So just take a minute if you would, and
there's a lot of B's and a lot of A's, more so B's though.
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. And a lot of A's, you said.
Yes, A's too.
Yeah. You know, it's really interesting when we ask this question. It seems like at the beginning, people were feeling less isolated, and that isolation has grown over time. In fact, there's a study that is also showing that the longer people have been working from home, the more they're feeling stressed, fatigued, exhausted. There's something about this as a marathon versus a sprint. The other thing that we're hearing is that at the beginning of this challenge, a lot of people were like, you know, I can weather it. We're going to get back to normal. And I think some of what people are struggling with lately is the feeling that this may not go back to normal. Like there may not be a normal in the same way that there has been before. And that's one of the challenges. Another element of our stress can also come from distractions. The new and interesting thing about working from home and not having our normal school systems and our normal childcare systems and our normal support systems is that distractions can be new and different. Like all of a sudden, instead of just working from home on a Friday afternoon or once a month, I'm home with my children and they need childcare, and I can't possibly be on a video conference with children running around in the background. Or I need to give my child support in terms of the learning that they're doing. Or I've got laundry that's beckoning to me and that needs my attention in the next room. You know, we used to talk about work life, and we would frequently talk about that necessary boundary and that necessary distinction. Work is part of life. Life is part of work, but we also need a little separation now and then. We used to talk about how do we leave work at work and spend time with family and home. And now we're hearing people saying, I need to get back to work so I can get away from my home for a little while. I might be having too many dirty dishes staring at me in the sink, or I had a little tiff with my partner or my spouse and I want to get to work in order to have that boundary. So distractions are new and different. They're not things that we're always used to in our day-to-day world as we're trying to work and be at home all the time. So how can you deal with them? First of all, planning for them as much as possible. So if you can plan for what's going to entertain your child, you know, while you're on a video call, there's a really cool new trend of virtual babysitting, where you literally hire these people who are kind of like fun and interesting people with, you know, bright colored shirts and cool personalities that kids like, and you can set them up on an iPad or on a screen, and they'll entertain your child for a while. Lots of new gig opportunities like that are coming to the fore. So you might be able to plan for some of those distractions, you know, plan for when those elements of life maybe don't have to intrude into work as much. And you can incorporate them. So one of the other interesting things that we've found are people being really creative about incorporating them. Like they'll build 15 minutes in between meetings and they'll do some dishes between meetings, which gives them a chance to reflect, but also gives them a chance to catch up on that distraction. I heard one story from a woman who said every time she has a minute between meetings, she goes and sprays down her bathtub with, I don't know, scrubbing bubbles or some cleanser. Like, it's just super interesting the way people think about these innovative new ways to cope. The other thing is to get some air. Neurologically, we know that nature is extraordinarily helpful in terms of helping us rejuvenate, helping us feel more alive, helping us feel more connected to what's around us. And so even if it's just standing by an open window, getting some air and getting some access to nature is a really good thing in terms of our mental health. Another thing I've been alluding to is that we are seeing really new pressures on people. There's a sociologist, Patricia Voidanoff, and she talks about the issue with work-life stress is all about the relationship of demand and capacity. Capacity is about what's my perception of how capable I am in terms of responding. And that can go up and down over your life, over your week, depending on whether you're in the middle of a pandemic or not. You know, there are times in your life when you can say to yourself, oh, I just can't handle one more thing. I'm on the edge. And there are other times in your life where you're just cranking, like bring it on. And so capacity shifts based on your kind of your mental well-being. But demand is also something that shifts. When we feel less choice at work, when we have a new project, when we have a conflict that is more personally based versus task oriented, those are things that put pressure and demand. And the other thing that places a lot of demands on us is fulfilling multiple roles. In all of the work-life research, one of the things that's true is the more roles you're trying to fulfill at the same time, the more challenging that can be. So, you know, like you didn't used to have to be a teacher and a full-time employee, unless you were a full-time teacher employee, in which case you're brilliant. But you may be fulfilling new roles around teaching, around childcare, around new sharing that you and your partner or spouse are doing in terms of taking care of the house. All of those new roles. You might be grooming your pet. You might be figuring out how to cut your own hair. You might be doing some basic roles that you never would have anticipated. And so that emphasis on new roles can be a really big deal. That places more demand, and you have to bring up your capacity. If all of a sudden you're the one who has to groom your dog, you got to watch the YouTube video about how on earth to groom your dog successfully. And so that adds a level of complexity and a level of new learning. And we talked about friction. It's another layer of that conscious friction that can arise. So how do you respond? One of the things that's really helpful is gratitude. In lots of studies, when we feel more thankful, more appreciative for what's around us, that adds to our sense of capacity, interestingly, and it adds to our sense of mental well-being. So I might feel grateful for the tiniest little things like, oh, I'm grateful I get to sit in a comfortable chair at the moment, or I'm grateful that I have a fire escape and I can get out for some fresh air, or oh my goodness, I'm really grateful that I can mow the lawn today because the weather is nice. Those might be small things, but every small thing makes a difference. We in our family are absolutely lamenting. We have a college senior and a high school senior, and we're lamenting all that they're losing in terms of graduation and ceremonies. But by goodness, we are focusing on feeling a lot of gratitude for the time that we've had together as a family. That can be stressful as well, all that family time. But as much as we can feel gratitude for those tiny things, even in the midst of it, is a good thing. The other thing that's helpful is a future focus. You want to stay present focused because you can only control what's right in the present. But that little bit of a sense of, this will change, a little bit of a sense for perspective, a little bit of a sense that this won't go on forever will also help. A really good friend of mine said, and I love this quote, when I was a little girl, she said, I used to always think that history was something that happened to other people. Isn't that lovely? All of a sudden she realizes that history happens to all of us. And this will be a dividing point in our lives. This will always be something that we remember and tell our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I remember life before the pandemic, and then there was life after the pandemic, but this will always be something that splits our lives. And so we want to think about how we will be different, how we will be enriched, and how we can learn from the experience. So here's a question for you. I've been talking too much. To what extent are you fulfilling multiple roles? So again, if you don't mind putting this in the chat, that would be lovely. A, tons. I feel like I'm doing everything for everyone, and sometimes I'm not sure how I'll cope. B, somewhat. I'm definitely doing more than I used to, but I'm not too overwhelmed yet. Or C, not so much. Things have changed, but they don't feel so very different from before. So think about those roles you might be playing and maybe give some thought to, are you feeling like you're fulfilling multiple roles? Tons, lots of different roles, lots of challenge, lots of demand. B, somewhat. Or C, not so much. Life hasn't changed so much for you. So we'll give you a minute to register your votes. What are we seeing?
A lot of A's and B's.
A's and
Yeah.
B's.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Brilliant. Yeah, that's definitely what we're seeing. And I think the surprise effect is interesting here too, right? Like none of us would have predicted the pandemic. I mean, maybe we would have with the right kind of intelligence if we had access to it. But like, I don't know, a year ago, would you have predicted this to your future self? Maybe not. Maybe you would have thought about helping your children with schoolwork. Maybe you would have thought about how you give care to people around you, elderly people or children. Those are roles that you would have anticipated, but these new roles can be really, really challenging, and all the new learning that they require and the new competencies that they require. Another thing that's super exhausting for us right now is intensity. Like that's one of the things that we've talked about is when you're on video conference all the time, or when you're connecting even with friends on camera, on a laptop, on a device, instead of in person, it tends to be all faces all the time. And you end up with use of your eyeballs more in close proximity. And that is challenging. It's mentally challenging, and it's actually physically challenging as well. When you are not in front of a screen, you can kind of look around more. You get more of a long view regularly. If you're in a conference room or a school or a childcare setting, you can look up, you can look around, you can move around the room. And that is so much less intense for us, that more expanded focus versus narrow focus. The other thing that adds intensity is the level of personal vigilance that happens. So we are so not used to seeing ourselves on camera all the time, and it's not always comfortable, right? Like, oh my gosh, you know, does my hair really look like that? Do I really, you know, do I really have that many wrinkles, or whatever your personal issue is? This is one of the things that can be really challenging. I did some research recently on flow. You know, flow is that mental state that athletes talk about, where you get into flow and you have amazing performance and you kind of lose yourself in the endeavor and you're able to reach whole new heights of effectiveness. One of the things that happens when you're in flow is you actually turn off the part of your brain that is paying attention to what's going on around you, and you get so focused on your goal that self-vigilance and that vigilance about others recedes into the background. And that's the opposite of what we're having today. We're so having to focus on this close proximity to others, and heaven forbid on ourselves on camera all the time, that it can be really intense. So what do we do about this one? Let your eyes wander. That's really, really helpful. Just kind of let your eyes go away, get out of your video screen now and then. I had a brilliant colleague say to me, you know, when I'm in really important meetings, I want to be on camera. We need that feeling of connection. We need the nonverbals that come through that type of communication. However, she said, you know, I used to make plenty of phone calls to friends in the olden days when I would just be on the phone and I wasn't on camera all the time. And so I thought that was brilliant advice. We want to be on camera when it's super critical to have that nonverbal communication and those nonverbal cues. But sometimes it's cool to just turn off the camera and just be able to talk to someone without worrying about whether your teeth are straight enough. The other thing is to focus on others. Like, it's really human nature to be able to be self-critical. You say to yourself, oh boy, gosh, oh my goodness, that's not quite what I wanted to see today. But the more we focus on others, the more we focus on generosity and altruism, the better, and the better that we can kind of have a sense of mental health One of the things we know about depression, one of the things we know about when people struggle with mental health is that perceptions tend to close in. The focus tends to narrow, and you end up focusing actually more on yourself. And when you focus on others, it widens that focus, it widens that lens in a really good way. So that connection point that we talked about earlier also applies here in terms of focusing on others and maybe not so much on yourself. The other thing that's challenging is information overwhelm. Like there's so much coming at us all the time. Really interesting research has been done on this topic lately. And when we're facing something that we don't know a lot about, the more we learn, the more we feel like we don't know. And then we can potentially get into a vicious cycle of craving more and more and more information and then marinating in it. And so what we want to do as much as possible is filter that information and set a super appropriate boundary and prioritize information. If you're getting more coming in than ever, you might choose to not pay attention to some of it. If you're getting more coming in than ever, you might choose to prioritize when and how you respond to things. You might also be really firm about boundaries. Like maybe you only watch the news for a half hour in the morning and a half hour in the evening because you don't want to be overwhelmed by it. Or maybe you don't talk about the pandemic over dinner when you're with your family or with your friends or with your partner or your spouse. You only talk about things that aren't pandemic related, as few of those as there are. But sometimes that filtering and that prioritization can be really helpful. The other thing to know about this one from a mental health perspective is that, you know, there's that statement, I'll believe it when I see it. The opposite is actually true neurologically. When we believe things, we tend to look for them. That's confirmation bias. We tend to find things that agree with our perspectives. The other new research that's just come out in the last month or so is that our state of mind significantly impacts our perception of the information coming at us. So if we're feeling really down and we hear some information about any topic, we will hear that as more negative information. If we're feeling negatively, we'll hear it more positively if we are feeling positive to begin with. So all those things we've talked about that help you feel more positive are also helpful in terms of creating a reinforcing loop that is positive. As you're feeling better, the context and the input to your situation will also feel better as well, and that will create a really nice positive loop. The other thing that's really challenging is a lack of movement. Your next posture is your best posture. You've heard that sitting is the new smoking. Well, actually, anything taken to an extreme, any too much standing, too much sitting, too much bending, too much anything is less helpful for you physically. So take micro breaks, get out into nature, and remember that your next posture is your best posture. You know what? Stress actually has some positive effects. I actually have an article coming out on this Sunday night. I was preparing for this session with you all and thought we need to really dig into this. So we'll send you the link for that one. But some of the positive effects of stress, I know it seems unrealistic, but it's true. When we are under more stressful conditions, we tend to build our resilience. Resilience is about three things. Resilience is about, number one, having a really clear sense of reality. Number two, being able to make sense of it, think it through, bring perspective to it. And number three, improvise. For those of you who are old enough to remember MacGyver, like me, MacGyver was like I need to research this a little more. He was kind of a high adventurer, like kind of a spy type person. And he would always get himself into these scrapes. And so he'd be like, you know, trapped somewhere and he had to get out of a scrape. And MacGyver was so improvisational that if he had a stick of gum and a paper clip and some duct tape, he could create a jet engine. He could get out of any situation. He could improvise. Resilience has to do with improvisation. So it's that ability to make it up, roll up your sleeves, figure it out, kind of put it together with duct tape and paper clips and chewing gum. So resilience is actually built through stress. The more we go through stress and work through it and adapt, the more resilient we become. The other thing is that stress can actually improve your perspective. I actually have a friend who's in military training, and he has been through some really terrible situations, like torrential rains where they're sleeping out all night, freezing with literally no shelter. They don't even have a tent, or having spider bites that send you to the emergency room, or, you know, walking through bogs and bogs of mud. Really, really tough challenges and tough situations. And they're putting the recruits through that process on purpose. So they've been through it before, and they're building their muscle. They're building their mental muscle to go through difficulty. And so Charlie says, you know, I slept through that torrential rain on that freezing cold night. And now if I get stuck in the rain when I'm running out to pick up my dinner, no big deal. You get this new perspective. When you've been through something really difficult, you can say to yourself, in the next difficult thing, you know, I went through the pandemic and I survived. I know I can get through this too. It also gives us a sense of creativity. Like, one of the things I love about innovation and creativity is the more the constraints, the greater the creativity. Any old person can come up with something if they don't have a lot of constraints. But when you have a lot of really difficult constraints, barriers, things that lock you in, it causes you to have to think very, very differently to get out. And so creativity might also be expanded, and you might just be open to new experiences. It's kind of like if you've been through the pandemic, that skydiving that you were thinking about before that might have seemed out of reach, maybe seems to be something pretty cool that you could try. Or maybe you want to take a new risk with your career, or maybe you want to try something new with your child in terms of a parenting approach or a schooling approach. You've been through this, and that might give you the ammunition and the fuel to start something different or try a new experience. Work is going to change in the future. I think it's going to be a really interesting new world. I think we're going to have more empathy from leaders, because leaders will have been living through work-life challenges themselves. I think there's no room for mediocrity, and there's no room for mediocre leaders. So I like to think that poor leaders will be weeded out, and the really great leaders will be recognized, rewarded, and they will come to the fore and do more modeling in terms of their behavior and influencing of others. I think companies are going to focus more on culture and organizational culture. Culture ends up being true north. It guides all of our decision making when we are at home, when we aren't in the close confines of work together with managers. And so culture ends up being really important. I think we're going to see more work-life flexibility. Lots of companies used to think that people couldn't work from home, and all of a sudden that's been forced out the window, and we have new levels of flexibility. I'm hearing lots and lots of companies saying that they're expecting to give more choice, more autonomy, and more options for people than they ever have before. The other thing that could be really cool is strengthened communities. The need to come together, driving our relationships with each other. It's really great. There's a wonderful suggestion from someone I saw recently that said, you know, we've been lamenting for our children and ourselves during these times, but what if this is a generation of kids who appreciates time with their families more than ever, who has new skills in playing checkers or chess or putting puzzles together? What if this is a generation that has more patience, maybe more focus on the present than ever before? What if we're strengthening our communities, strengthening our connections with each other, and strengthening some of those bonds together? And for the future, we can learn patience and gratitude and self-discipline, and ultimately we need to care for ourselves through all of this. That's the key thing, right? You hear this example in this analogy all the time. Put on your own oxygen mask before you put on others. All of a sudden masks have a whole new definition as well, don't they? But when you're on a plane, someday in the future, when you're on an airplane again, you want to put on your own oxygen mask before helping others. And that is true here too. We need to make sure we're taking care of ourselves, our mental health, our physical health, our emotional health, in order to care for others. We will get through it. It's tough, it's really tough, but we know that we can not just survive, but thrive through it. So there's hope for a new normal. I think it might be hope for a new abnormal. I need to add a parenthesis that says abnormal there. I don't know if it'll ever go back to the way it was, but by goodness, we will survive and thrive through it, and we'll stick together and do that well as a community. So with that, let me open it up for questions. This is, I showed you a photo of our family when I just went back to school when the kids were about 5 and 9-ish. This is our family last summer. We're all growing up and growing older way too quickly. So with that, let me see what kinds of questions we have, Brooke and Fanny, and we'll go from there.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, the question that I saw one that said missing physical connection with family members. Obviously, these are people that do not live in the home with them, and wondering how do you adjust or adapt to that?
Oh, that is the $6 million question, isn't it? I just like the really hard thing is we need physical connection. I just wrote an article actually on social distancing. And you know, there's all this wonderful suggestion to call it physical distancing instead of social distancing. We might need the physical distance, but we want the social connectedness. But even so, that physical connection is critical. When we experience physical touch, we get a shot of oxytocin in our brains that literally helps us feel happier, more connected. It's literally a neurochemical that's released every time we touch someone. A neuroscientist friend suggests that everybody needs 6 hugs a day in order to feel their best. Well, lots of us are absolutely not getting that, right? And interestingly, the people who may be getting that least are the elderly, because those are the people that we're protecting at a physical level. So I don't know the answer. I don't know how we get enough physical touch, physical connectedness. One thing that we do know is virtual counts, and the more virtual connection you can have, the better. Proximity is one of the most important drivers of relationship. The more you see people, sociologically and psychologically, the more you identify with those people. And the more you identify with people, the more positively you feel toward them. So the more you can just be connected, even if it's on a screen, the better. And I think the other thing is to focus on other things that are really familiar. There's some interesting new research. You're going to laugh about this and think it's crazy, that there's some interesting research that when you watch television shows that are familiar, it can give you a sense of comfort. Like you watch that old rerun that you loved, or music that is very familiar can be very comforting for people. Anything that feels familiar can start to fulfill some of those needs for connection. Crazy.
So no, I love it, because I won't even tell you the shows that I love that my husband thinks I'm nuts, because I still love watching them. They're shows from my childhood.
I love it.
There's another question. Yeah, I mean, oh my God, I do. And I'm okay with that, and I make no apology for it. There's another question here, and I know that there are several people that are probably dealing with this. Being in quarantine alone, you know, that there are several people online and they live alone. How do you deal with that, you know?
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things. Like, it's so interesting. We hear lots and lots and lots about people who are struggling because they've got, you know, people in the background and lots of people in a, you know, single room, and there's no place to isolate and no place to get away. But the opposite can actually be really, really hard. And so that is just all about virtual connection as much as possible, and really being intentional about those connections, whether those are casual, like informal connections, like, you know, a happy hour together or a brunch together, or coffee together virtually, or if you insert yourself into some volunteer opportunities. One of the things, I wrote an article about this a while ago, but volunteering is actually correlated with higher salaries and more job growth and job promotion. Interesting. And it's correlated with people just feeling better mentally. And so if there are ways to give and connect even virtually, Maybe you join a board, maybe you join an association, maybe there are new connections that you can make even beyond your existing connections. And we talked about the familiar, which relates here too. And there's always the great idea to get a pet. Not everybody's a pet person, but that can be nice to just, you know, have somebody to say hello to you when you walk in the door on those rare occasions when you go out.
Yes, yes, and yes. Excuse me, I'm seeing a lot of people commenting on how much they're enjoying this presentation. Brooke, Mariah, I'm trying to read this long comment or question, and so hang in there.
No worries. Yeah, go ahead and.
Yeah, my husband is listening on this, and he said he really appreciates this. Yeah, I asked him, he's a retired gentleman, and so I asked him, I said, just sit in on this. So I'm trying to get it, let's see if I can get this question.
Fanny, it was more like a comment. It was not like really
It was a comment? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good. Okay. Well, it's obvious that people are lots and lots of positive comments about the presentation. Then there are, and I love the things that you were talking about. One comment you made that got a ton of reaction was virtual babysitting. Yeah, we got a lot of reaction out of that. It's going to be interesting because I would love to hear the outcome and how that all turned out. Yeah. But yeah. So I know that we've shared articles with our audience and that sort of thing. But say you're the family that have the kindergarten, you have a teen, your husband, and you are all home and dealing with all of that. How do you begin to structure all of that and work with that that setup?
That's a great question. And going back to that virtual babysitting, yeah, right. Isn't that interesting? You say to yourself, how could that possibly work? But God bless us for trying some new things. You never know. Yeah. The other thing I think is pretty cool is all of the new ideas that people have for entrepreneurialism and new ways that they're contributing. So, you know, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't work. Either way, we learn from it, and that's going to be really cool. In terms of all that proximity, I think your point about you use the word structure. I think that's probably super, super smart. And one of the other things we know is the more you can raise discussions about norms and behaviors kind of to the conscious level, to the explicit level, the better. Like a lot of times we just go about our day and we're not talking to each other about how we're going about our day. So I might be darn frustrated that I'm trying to be in the living room and you're sitting in the living room too, for goodness sakes. But we don't necessarily say that out loud. And I think the more we can be really open about what we need and potentially structure, like I want to watch my show in the living room and you want to watch your show in the living room. And maybe we just need to talk through that and figure out, I get 2 hours from 10 to 12 and you get 2 hours from 12 to 2 and somebody else. The other thing that's interesting is kind of this idea of going to your corners. This blows my mind. As a sociologist, there are some organizations that are like they're starting to return people to work. And so they're having to do temperature checks as people enter the building. And in the nicer climates, they've put squares on the pavement so that everybody's appropriately social distanced while they're waiting in line to get in the building for their temperature check. And so the instruction we're giving to people is stand in the box. Like, oh my gosh, it's the right thing, right? Like it's health, it's safety, it's the right thing to do. But we've gotten to the point that we're telling people to stand in a box. The other thing that I think is super interesting is I've seen some really great examples in elevators of signs that say, stand in the corner, again, because we're trying to social distance or physically distance. And so now we're telling ourselves to go stand in the corner, right? Like at some level, you just have to laugh. Like it's the right thing, but it's just crazy to think about. And so that might be something that we do at home too, you know, like, I get the kitchen, you get the living room, you get the right corner, I get the left corner, and we're gonna give ourselves that little bit of distance. But I think the big takeaway is that we're open with each other about it. We're open about what we need. We talk about what we need. We talk about our challenges so that we can work through them together and realize that we have a common goal of surviving this. We might have some common issues, and we might be able to have a sort of a common need to fulfill them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's, Dr. Brower, this has been absolutely a fabulous presentation, and it is obvious through all the comments in the chat box saying thank you for this awesome presentation. And there were so many great points that were made, tips that they can take away and bring back into their homes, because that's where they are. And we just want to thank you again for this awesome presentation. For those of you who you can share this, that we will have a recording of this, and we will share this with all of you, everybody who registered. We will share this, and then we will post it on our website for future viewing and listening. Again, thank you so very much for this wonderful presentation, and you've given us some tools that we can work with. And my big takeaway is to be kind to ourselves as we walk through this process. And it is a process. No one has ever been here before. No one have all the answers, but collectively we can do this together, and we'll get through it. We will.
That's beautifully said. Beautifully said.
Yeah.
And please reach out, like on LinkedIn or other social media, please reach out. I just always want to be learning from each other, learning from the community. And Fanny, you just said it so beautifully. Like, we will get through this together. None of us knows what's next, but by goodness, we'll get through it.
Well, I hope you know that I'm going to be knocking on your door again for coming back. You're just so wonderful, and you're a delight to work with, and you brought such great, thoughtful information. So what we want to say is thank you to you. Thank you to all of you who shared your hour with us. Be kind to yourselves and be kind to others. Have a wonderful day. Thank you again, Tracy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone. You too.